Hey everyone, welcome back to another book club. Thanks a lot for joining me. This evening I want to be discussing sort of some concepts around general and specific strength. We're going to talk about assessing your strength and as well as some programming. And this is covered in pretty good detail in chapters 7 and 8. So today we'll be kind of not glossing over, but covering that in a fairly cursory manner because there's so much detail here that's covered well in the book. But I hope to hit some of the high points and also go down a couple of rabbit holes with regards to some very specific ideas here. So just like in all our views on training, we want to assess the demands of the event. So for most of these endurance events, and especially the ultra endurance type events, anything lasting more than a few hours, absolute strength is really not particularly important. Being able to deadlift twice your body weight or bench press 400 pounds is not going to make you a better mountain runner, mountaineer, climber, whatever. That type of kind of general or gross strength is not effectively going to produce a better athletic performance. Because remember, what the strength training for athletes is meant to improve their athletic performance. It is not designed to make you have a better bench press in the gym. That's not very important at all. And one of the reasons that is that absolute strength, and you can watch anybody who's lifting a very heavy weight, whether it's a power lifter or just you in the gym lifting something close to your maximum, you'll notice that the rate of muscle force generation, the rate of force muscle contraction and movement is quite slow. And that's not a very athletic thing. In athletics, we're trying to move quickly. We're trying to, especially in these sports that we do, the speed of movement is very important. So training your brain for this very slow movement at a very high force is very unsport specific. So if you can do simple things like, deadlift your body weight, let's say, step up on a box with half your body weight on your shoulders, step up on a knee-high level box, let's say, with about half your body weight, or can do a single pull-up, you probably have adequate strength for most of these activities, adequate general strength. But what we're going to talk about once we establish that you have decent general strength is how to improve that in a more sports-specific way, which will involve power and speed of movement. So one of the most important things with all of these foot-borne, leg-propelled activities is single leg stability. And that's one of the reasons that typical general strength activities like a squat or a deadlift with a barbell are not super applicable to let's say running or hiking, skiing, because you just rarely are you going to have both feet planted on the ground, which gives you a very stable platform. And it's the reason people can lift very heavy weights when they've got both feet on the ground, because it's stable. And that means that the stabilizer muscles around the joints, the muscles that are doing the job of keeping that joint stable so that the what we might call the prime mover muscles can do their job effectively, those stabilizer muscles are not having to activate to such a large degree. And you can prove this to yourself by take your maximum weight that you can lift, whether it's a squat or a deadlift, with both feet on the ground, and see if you can do a similar movement with one leg. And you'll see that no, single leg, you're nowhere near as strong. You're much less than half as strong with single leg movements than you are with both legs. And that's because when you're in a single leg stance, the hip muscles have to do a great deal of work to stabilize the pelvis and the knee joint so that the prime mover muscles can do their jobs of propelling you. So there's minimal to be gained, I believe, from a big focus on a lot of two-legged strength work. Once you can do something like lift your body weight, then I think it's time to move on to single leg, something that's somewhat more specific. Same thing. Well, with actually not quite the same, but with general shoulder strength and stability, the shoulder is a fairly unstable joint. And so it's important to have good shoulder stability and health. And that's a little beyond what we're going to talk about here, because it's kind of a whole episode of its own. So it's talking about training this shoulder stabilizers. And for, if we were focused more on, let's say, people like rock climbers who would need to generate a lot more force through their shoulders, that would be a good discussion for us to have. And maybe we'll do that at another time. But I think we've got enough to cover talking about hip and leg stability, excuse me. So I also want to talk about, then once we have established that you have good stability in the hips and you can produce a fair bit of force in a stable, safe position, then we're going to move on to something that's much more sport specific, and that will be developing power on a single leg and muscular endurance on a single leg. So we'll get into that later as we go. So we're going to just cover some pretty basics of general strength in this talk. The internet is full of strength training information. Some of it is very good and some of it's kind of crazy. But a lot of what's out there isn't really focused on single leg strength, because most people that are interested in strength training are interested in strength training just because they want to get stronger at a particular type of lift. And we're talking about something that's actually quite different than that. And there's a lot of ways to improve general strength. The exercises we're going to talk about we've used for years. They work really well, but there are variations to this. And it doesn't mean that if somebody says, oh, here's a better way to improve hip strength, then that you shouldn't potentially be using that. But I think I'll cover enough basic exercises here that will help improve hip strength and stability. So anyway, we'll move on to that. One of the things I want to look at here is what's going on in the hip. And as you can see, these are all the muscles of the hip and leg. Now, in this middle one, on just left of center here where my cursor is moving around, you'll notice now the big muscle, the gluteus maximus, which is this muscle here I'm on the left with my cursor, you can see that. In this one, it's been cut away. And if you'll notice, there are a plethora of littler muscles underneath that gluteus maximus that attach to what's called the greater trochanter. Way over here on the right, you can see the greater trochanter. That's the knob at the top of your femur that of course, the ball is more in this part, but the knob out here, this greater trochanter, is where a lot of these muscles attach. And these are the muscles that are primarily doing the stabilizing of the hip joint. Now, they do have other purposes in terms of moving your hip to the side. There are other things there are times when those stabilizer muscles actually become the prime movers. But for forward propulsion, whether it's skiing or running or hiking uphill, climbing, that sort of thing, these muscles primarily act in a stabilizing function, so that the bigger muscles like the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings and the quadriceps, that they can do their work in propelling you. And if these muscles in here, which are hard to see and hard to activate, are not doing their job adequately, then you're going to have an unstable hip. And the problem with that is that will limit the amount of force that the big muscles like these quadriceps or the hamstrings or this gluteus maximus muscle here, it'll limit the amount of work those guys can do effectively. And it also can set you up for injuries in the knee and the ankle and the hip. So making sure that you've got good hip stability is job number one. And I only put this in here so you can see just how complex all this structure is and why it often is overlooked. Most strength training, and as I just alluded to on the last slide, when you're in a stable position with both feet planted firmly on smooth or flat ground, these little muscles here in the hip stabilizers don't have so much to do. And that allows the big muscles more freedom to do a better job. And it's, again, why you can easily lift more than twice the weight with two legs than you can with one. What happens when these hip stabilizers aren't doing their job is we can end up with what's called a valgus knee. That's this picture over here on the left. Now, this can also come from some deformities in the hip joints or in the knees. But to a large extent, for most athletes, the most common thing we'll see is that these knees cave in under load. This is showing a person or someone who's standing without, we would assume, without much load on their knees, on their legs. And their knees are, as we call this, knock-kneed. Their knees are coming very close together. But in our case, this would be something that happens under heavy load. This would be, in the middle one, shows a more normal alignment of the femur and the tibia. And then we have bow-legged way over here on the right, which is less common, but still does happen. And the reason this is a problem how it can be fixed is that if the hip stabilizers are weak and you load the knee, most likely it's going to cave in to this valgus position. And what happens when it does that is you get impact. And you'll see that when that joint angle is more than that valgus angle is more than about 20 degrees, puts a lot of pressure here between this lateral condyle, this outside the knob on the bottom of your femur, which is called a condyle. This is the lateral condyle, puts a lot of pressure right in here where the cartilage is on the top of the tibia. And doing that and loading it progressively or over and over and over again, like you would do if you were running, as you can imagine, was going to lead to problems. And when you have a more normal angle, like was shown here, where it's 10 or 15 degrees, then you're going to have equal loading across the lateral and the medial condyle of the femur, and these two little places where the cartilage is on the top of the tibia. And that's going to be a healthier normal knee that's going to stand up much better to abuse. And since these activities that we're talking about, endurance activities, require thousands and thousands of repetitions, you can see where doing thousands of load-bearing repetitions through a knee like this would potentially cause problems. Oops, I got off the slide, sorry. That this knee with a big valgus angle to it would be a problem. And this is more common with women than men. Prepubescent girls will have hips that look more like a guy. That's why boys and girls at that age tend to have pretty similar body type. But as girls go through puberty and the hips get wider, this, what's called the Q angle, this valgus angle, increases. And as a consequence, women tend to be, not always, but tend to be more susceptible to knee problems like this. Now, I used to coach a lot of young girls in the sport of cross-country skiing, and I saw this literally take place before my eyes over the course of a few years as they went through their early teenage years. And they would go from being great little runners and skiers with no knee problems whatsoever when they're 11 or 12 to, by the time they're 16 or 17, having knee pain and knee problems. And while you can't fix the anatomy, we're not going to change the way these bones are growing. What I found was by being really proactive at trying to increase the strength of those hip stabilizer muscles that I showed you back here, that I could mitigate the problems that those girls were running into in terms of knee pain. And so the same thing is true for a guy. If you're a guy with knee pain and poor hip stability, then you should be focused on improving that hip stability. And so there's a few ways to assess this. These are all covered in that, I think it's chapter 7 of the book, where we're doing the assessment. So I'm not going to show pictures or go into great detail, but I'm going to run through this. So the first and simplest way is having someone do an air squat, which is just squatting down with no added load other than squatting. And if when they squat, their knees come together like this, that would indicate weak hip stabilizers. Next one, so that would be what we call level 1. And if you have that amount of weakness in the hip stabilizers, then you really can use some very basic exercises, which we'll get to here in a minute. Level 2, we would have a person step up onto a box that's about knee height. And in doing so, notice if the knee, as you step up onto that box and load that knee, if the knee collapses inward more than, let's say, about an inch, then likewise, you've got some hip stabilizer muscle work to do. Same thing for stepping down off of a box. You're not going to step down off of a 16-inch box, but maybe off of a 10-inch box. And likewise, if the knee that stays up on the box that's more heavily loaded collapses in by more than about an inch, then you've got some hip stabilizer work that needs to be done. So the next and most difficult exercise in this list of assessment exercises is using a single leg sit to stand. So this would be sitting on a low bench that's only at about knee height, so something that's lower than a normal chair. But you can use a chair to try it first and try to stand up from a seated position with a single leg. And notice what happens to the knee. Does it collapse inward or not? This is much more difficult than any of these previous assessments because it requires a great deal more strength in the prime movers, and it also a lot of more coordination in those stabilizer muscles. And if you're at that level and you can do this well, then you're going to move on directly to the most specific type of training, which we're going to get to at the end, which is power type work. So some hip strengthening exercises that you can use, and in general, especially at these lower, at level 1 and 2, it's going to be a fairly high repetition circuit that you're going to do, or fairly high repetition with each exercise, and that's because you're trying to teach the brain this new movement that you may not have totally dialed. And so these need to be done carefully, slowly, not sloppily. So these are detailed in the book in chapter 7. So banded air squats, and that's just taking an exercise band around your knees or just below the knee, and with some load in them. So within your feet spread apart slightly. So there's some inward pressure from the rubber band. You're going to squat and stand up. It'll be more like a half squat and then stand. And this will help strengthen those stabilizer muscles in the hip. Similarly, you can do the same thing when you're walking with your feet are going to be spread somewhat wide. You're going to walk forward with that, and you can take lateral steps. And again, these are all targeted at firing up those stabilizer muscles that are buried in the hip. And you can do kind of a single leg standing skating movements where you're standing, let's say, on your left foot with this rubber band roughly around your knees or below your knees, and push laterally with the right foot while you're standing on the left. I've noticed when I do this that I feel the most activation of those hip muscles on the left leg, the one I'm standing on, not necessarily the one that I'm pushing out to the side with. And then there are some side-lying leg raise routines. There's quite a few of these on the internet. My favorite one was put out by this guy, Ryan Flaherty, who is a strength coach for Nike. And he's worked with a lot of professional sports teams. He calls it the 7-way hips. If you go on YouTube and just Google 7-way hips, Ryan Flaherty, you will find it. It's a great, very simple routine. to run through. And these can be used as a circuit. You can run through these and do 3 times through this whole circuit. It won't take long. In a few weeks, you're going to notice big changes in your hip strength. Now, if you're at the level 2, which was those box step up and step down, that you can do that, but you see a little bit of caving in of the knee, then you would start this workout, same sort of thing, 3 times through a 20 rep circuit of you warm up with those level 1 exercises, maybe just 1 time through them. And then you're going to do a box step up and down, step up onto a box, maybe 20 times with one leg, then 20 times with the other, then go to a lower box and step down, 20 times and touching only your heel. You don't want to push back up with your toes, and you're going to be loading that leg that stays up on the box. Another great exercise for this is the front lunge. And then the single leg Romanian deadlift. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically a straight leg deadlift, but with only one leg. So there's tons of examples and videos of this on the internet. So it's a pretty straightforward, simple exercise, but very good for hip stability. And then the hip bridge, which is where you lie in a supine position, so that's on your back on the floor, shoulders and hands on the floor, and bring your feet kind of close to your butt so your knees are bent roughly 90 degrees, and then lift your hips and hold that, trying to feel your glutes activate. And if that is too easy, you can do this with one leg at a time. Lift one leg and hold that bridge for 5 seconds. This would be one you're not going to do 20 repetitions of. Do it, hold it for 5 seconds, then switch to the other leg, hold for 5 seconds, and do that maybe 5 or 6 times before you start the circuit over again. And when you get to level 3, then the focus changes more towards strength than activation. So we're going to a lower number of repetitions and a higher resistance here, 80 to 90% of your 1 rep maximum. So you'd run through level 1 exercises 1 time just to warm up, and then you're going to use these exercises that you just learned from level 2, and you're going to use those, but with much more resistance, so that you're going to be doing 5 repetitions as opposed to 20. So and the way you can do that is, it can be done with a barbell, it can be done with a weight vest, it can be done with a pack full of sandbags, dumbbells in your hands, a lot of different ways to do this, to increase that resistance. And again, these will have dramatically rapid improvements in your hip strength, primarily because most of us haven't focused on this kind of stuff. But we first need to be able to activate, and that's why this is broken into these 3 levels, is that if you can't activate or can't fire those muscles, then you can't strength train them. And so that's the reason we do this high repetition, working towards low repetitions with higher weights later on. With upper body assessment, it's going to be a similar type of thing, but we're going to look at doing something like a push-up plank hold. Can you hold? You can do this either in a push-up position or in a normal planking position with your elbows on the ground, your forearms on the ground, and that'll be a little bit easier. But can you hold a plank for 5 seconds? If not, then you probably definitely want to start with level 1, and we're going to be doing 3 sets of like 10-second holds here. And if you need to do on your knees to do the plank, that's fine. And when you can hold the plank or push-ups, we're going to move on to things like incline push-ups or go from your toes push-ups. And the other thing we'll do in this is bench dips. And a bench dip is where you back up against a chair or a bench. You're facing away from it. Put your hands on the edge of the chair and dip yourself down. You can use either bent legs or straight legs out in front of you, which gets a little bit harder. So we'll do this same sort of thing with level 2, but by then we've kind of moved away from the incline, or excuse me, from the knees to full push-up position and a more normal bar dip. So you'd be doing three sets of 10, or going to failure, either one. Both of these will have a big effect. There are other ways to do shoulder strengthening, and if you have painful shoulders, then that's going to require a different focus, and we maybe get into that in a later discussion, though, because the shoulders are pretty complicated. The level 3 would just be something more difficult with weight. So level 2 exercises, push-ups and dips with added resistance. And the way we show that in the book is, you can do everything from a weight vest to having someone hold, or you can even manage to get a weight plate and balance it on your back when you get into a push-up position. And so likewise with pull-ups, if you can do fewer than 3 pull-ups, then you'll be advised to do something like scapular retraction pull-ups. So that's hanging from a bar and just pulling up without bending your elbows or really rotating around your shoulders, just pulling the scapula down and together. That's, again, shown a lot. If you look on YouTube under scapular retraction, you'll see these exercises. Incline pull-ups, so we're using a ring or rings or TRX or a bar in a squat rack. So you're getting your body at an incline and pulling the barbell up to your chest, pulling yourself up to a bar, or pulling yourself up on rings or TRX. So we just do these things, 3 sets of 10. And then the other is, if you can do this, get your chin above the bar, do an isometric hold. So lock off with your chin above the bar in a pull-up position, and then lower for 3 seconds or so. And if you can do between 3 and 10, then I would recommend pull-ups, that is, then I would recommend doing something like a more like 5 by 5. So 5 sets of 5 reps, take a nice long rest so you can complete all 5 with good form. And if you can do more than 10, you've got perfectly good basic pull-up strength. Upper body strength is good. Pull-ups is probably one of the best general upper body strength measurements that there is. And you can, and if you need to, you can add weight. And there's an article in there. Just let me grab a book and I will tell you what page it's on. Sorry, my book's right here. And let me get the strength chapter in this book. It is on page 228. In Training for the New Alpinism, there's a great maximum strength training program for pull-ups in there. So then the next is looking at core strength. So core is really important. Core strength is important for hip stability, because the core's main job when we're in a locomoting movement like running, let's say, is to keep the hips stable. And the primary muscle that does this is called the transverse abdominis, and it's the deepest muscle in the core group of muscles, so it's kind of buried under everything else. It doesn't move any joints, so that's one of the reasons it's hard to learn to activate. So the moving very roughly from an anatomical standpoint, the most superficial core muscles would be the rectus abdominis, that's the six-pack muscle. It's the farthest away from the spine because it's right under the skin of your stomach. And so it has the most leverage over the spine. And its job is to flex the spine forward. Then you have some muscles called the obliquus. What are they? Abdominis obliquus, something like that. Sorry, not an anatomist. Anyway, these are meant to rotate the shoulders and the hips relative to one another about the spine. And so they're kind of a twisting motion. And then underneath all of that is this transverse abdominis, which essentially acts like a girdle. And it holds everything, all the guts of us, into the core, into our torso, but it also connects our hips all the way up to our shoulders and through the ribs. by kind of when you lock it up, it makes this girdle-like effect to stabilize the spine and the hips. So it's important for especially running. And in people that don't have good hip stability or good core strength in their hips, you'll often see their hips rock from side to side when you look at them from the front or the back, which can cause, again, some overuse injuries if it's excessive and you do a lot of it. So what I have found is the best way to strengthen this transverse abdominis, because it's not as obvious as, let's say, doing crunches or sit-ups, which is really works the rectus abdominis, or doing twisting movements like the windshield wipers, which works those oblique muscles, is to do a plank. And when you're doing this plank, you want to make sure, so just think about doing a plank from elbows, forearms on the ground, and toes up off the toes on the ground. And you're going to try to contract this transverse abdominis so that you don't sag in the middle. If you are sagging, then this is going to be a really good exercise for you. If you can't hold this for a minute, then you definitely need work on this transverse abdominis, and planking, in my mind, is probably the best way to do that. Then this windshield wiper is very good for training those oblique muscles. And you want to do this with a really good form. In other words, feet together, legs straight, overhead. This exercise is shown in the book as well. And see if you can manage 10 reps of that. And if you can't, then this, again, will be a very good exercise for you. If you need to start with your knees bent, go ahead, that's perfectly fine. But eventually you'd like to work towards having your knees straight when you're doing this. And then the hanging leg raise, which I think is good for improving all of the hip flexor muscles, as well as some of the abdominal muscles as well. So hanging from a bar, you can hang straight arm, although I think bent arm is a little more challenging and a little more effective, let's say, for climbers. But hanging with a straight arms, it requires a bit more hip flexibility, and you're going to try to pull your feet up, your knees up to your chest. Again, this exercise is demonstrated in the books. And if you can't use straight legs, then do bent knees and pull your knees up to your chest. With your straight legs, unless you have really good hip flexibility and hamstring flexibility, you'll probably have a hard time getting your straight legs with getting your toes over the bar. But that would be a target to shoot for. But these are probably some of the best core exercises I've come across. They're very simple, straightforward. And now we're going to move on to some specific strengthening. As I mentioned, once you've got good stability in the hips and good general strength, then it's time to move to something that's more athletically specific, which is power. In other words, how rapidly can you produce force in your legs in this case, because we're talking about running. And I think that doing things like hill sprints, with or without poles. If you're a runner, then without, maybe. And if you're a skier, then hill sprints with poles. You can do ski erg sprints if you are a skimo racer or even ski tourer, and these will help develop power in your upper body. And the hill sprints are very well described in the books, but essentially what you're going to do after a very thorough warm-up on a relatively steep grade, I would say a minimum of 15 to 20% grade. And the steeper the grade, the more powerful it will be. The more you will have to be to make this work. You do need good footing. And doing this on stairs is a really good way to do it, because stairs, let's say fire stairs in a building or stairs in a stadium, they'll tend to be at least in that 20 to 30%, maybe even more gradient. And so they're plenty steep enough, but they allow perfect traction, and you don't have to worry about stepping over roots or rocks or losing traction on dirt. And so I think if you have a good set of steep stairs, it's a great way to build power in your legs, is sprinting on those stairs. You'll want to have the sprints be short, like 10, 12 seconds is plenty. And you want to take a long recovery between the repetitions of at least a couple of minutes so that you are able to produce high power on each repetition. And the way I just help people decide when enough is enough is when you can no longer reach your high point. So after 4 or 5 of these sprints, if you notice you're not able to get to the same spot you've been getting to on the hill, then the workout's done. Because this is not an endurance workout. This is trying to develop maximum power. And once you can no longer develop that maximum power, there's really no point in continuing, because then you're not training power anymore. You're starting to train endurance. So just stop when you do this. Endurance athletes often have a hard time wrapping their heads around this kind of training because it's so antithetical to the way a endurance athlete trains, which is to make themselves tired and then continue going for a long time. But in this, it's to be fresh. You want to do this workout when you are well rested, so that your legs can produce that power. And the same protocol can be used with something like ski erg sprints. This could also be done on roller skis if you were a cross-country skier. And we want to elevate this power and force production with these power workouts. And then eventually we will move into muscular endurance training, which is where we try to extend a high percentage of that power production over longer and longer periods of time. And that's for endurance sports, that's the most specific type of strength training, is muscular endurance training. Many of you are probably familiar with it because I've written, tens of thousands of words about muscular endurance training. It's in both the books. It's all over the website. If you're not familiar with it, please just look into those and you'll understand a little more why this is so important to endurance athletes. But it's, for almost every endurance athlete, the single biggest limitation to their performance is going to be local muscular fatigue or local muscular endurance. In other words, this is fatigue that you can feel in the muscles. It's not a global type of fatigue. It's not a fatigue that's brought on by heavy breathing. It's brought on, although it can occur during that. This is a fatigue that you're going to feel where, oh my gosh, my legs are dead. Or I would love to be able to run faster than this, but my legs can't keep it up any longer. And so that's what muscular endurance is. And you can read more about the theory of it in the books and on the website. And so when we get into power training, it's going to look, something really very simple besides the hill sprints. It could start with something like this, where it's single leg hopping. So this person, it's a little hard to see here, but he's on his right leg from position A to position F. So he's compressing here in position A and B, pushing off powerfully in C, flying through the air in D, and then landing in E and F. And single leg hopping is a great way to introduce power, especially if you don't have a hill, and doing it do 5 single leg hops in a row with one leg, and then switch and do 5 single leg hops on the other leg. And it requires a lot of coordination, balance, and hip stability to produce good power. And you will almost undoubtedly find that you have a disparity in how far you travel in each of these. If you have a way of measuring, you can see your progress, with these type of workouts. And, if you can move this, if this is all you ever do if this general single leg hopping is all you ever do for leg power, it will improve your leg power dramatically. If you have an opportunity to take that into a more sports specific activity, like over here on the right, where we see this skier bounding and sprinting up a hill with his poles, that's even better. But if you're stuck in flat ground and you just have access to a gym, this single leg hops are a great way to develop that kind of power. Another way would be if you have access to a sled, like a lot of gyms nowadays have sleds where you can push or pull and drag a sled, where you're sprinting with the resistance. If you recall from in training for the new alpinism, there's a picture in that book of Steve sprinting up a hill, dragging a car tire. That's dragging a tire is another way to develop this kind of power, especially if you don't have a particularly steep hill. But this would be the target, over here. This, hill sprints, I think, are the best specific leg power training for runners, and actually for any mountain athlete. We tend to use this type of power training, and my feeling is it can be used throughout a training cycle, from the very beginning basic base period all the way through into a competition period. Never more than once a week. We don't typically do this more than once a week. We see really good gains one time a week. This should not be an exhausting workout. Remember, you're going to stop as soon as the power begins to drop off here. So you're not going to get trashed from this. It's usually a workout that should leave you fairly energized. And so you could do this before, let's say you could do a sprint or a power workout like this in the morning, and then in the evening do a muscular endurance workout, or a power workout in the morning, and then in the evening go for a longer run, or even do some aerobic intensity interval training in the evening. And this will help wake up your legs a bit for that second workout in the day. But again, not exhausting. And you can use it all year long. I think most people can use more power. And when it comes to adding in muscular endurance work, so remember that what I was just saying was that this is more of a local or peripheral limitation. It's not related to, a global sense of fatigue. It's more, you're able to pinpoint it and go, oh boy, I feel that in my legs. And it's typically going to be at a submaximal intensity, because it needs to be sustained for quite a few repetitions in a workout, or quite a long time. If you're not in a let's say a gym setting, we have two different ways we typically train this. One is in a gym, and those workouts are well described in both the books, as well as on the website. There's a free download, I think, of a PDF there. You can take it with you and use that for a very effective gym muscular endurance workout. It can also be used or done by overloading the legs by putting a heavy weight on your back and hiking steeply uphill. This can be done most effectively actually on a Stairmaster or stair machine in a gym, because it's so steep that it's very hard to find a hill outside that is that steep that will actually give you decent footing. So that's a great way to do it, is actually indoors. It's boring as heck, but if you are able to do it on outdoors, and you can find a hill that's in the 30 to 50% gradient range, you'll want to have ski poles for this, because it's going to be slippery. It's because the dirt is going to give way, and you're going to be sliding around a little bit. So something to help stabilize it. But you're going to put a weight on that is so heavy that you will almost immediately notice that the limitation is in the leg muscles. And it's not necessarily, your breathing and heart rate will go up, but that's not necessarily what's limiting you. So keep that in mind. This works. You might have read the little article I did on the frontier fiber model in the Training for the Uphill Athlete book. That this is kind of my theoretical view of how this is working, is that we have pools of, our brain is able to recruit muscle fibers, and we have what's called the general pool of recruitable fibers. These are fibers that the brain is well trained to recruit. So if you always go out and jog around at 12-minute miles, your brain gets really good at recruiting these relatively low force developing muscle fibers, and doing it over and over and over for thousands of repetitions. So the wiring from the brain to the muscle gets very good. And as we move up the power scale, and I'm going to use running here because it's a pretty simple way to demonstrate this, but let's say we move up from a 12-minute mile to a 10-minute mile. Now the brain is going to have to recruit a somewhat bigger and slightly different pool of muscle fibers to produce enough force to cause you to travel at a 10 minutes per mile pace. Likewise, if you run at an 8-minute mile pace or a 6-minute mile pace, each time you move up the speed scale, the brain has to recruit a slightly bigger and different pool of muscle fibers in order to propel you at that speed. The faster the speed that you're running at, the less endurance those fibers have, because the brain hasn't spent as much, those fibers haven't been trained as much, and the brain isn't as good at recruiting them, because you can't spend as much time running at a 6-minute mile pace as you can running at a 10-minute mile pace. So those 10-minute mile fibers, they're recruited even when you're running a 6-minute mile. Those 10-minute mile fibers are being recruited, but each increasing speed adds to this pool of recruited fibers. And so these fibers that are close to the limit of the speed that you have endurance to run at, those are what I would call, they're on the frontier of your endurance. And they're the least well-trained endurance-wise. They have the least aerobic capacity in these, but they also are higher force. They need to be a higher force fiber. They're more of a fast twitch type fiber in order to produce the force that's needed to propel you through the air at the speeds that you would need to, at the speed you're trying to run at. So those fibers, these frontier fibers, they represent the limitations to your endurance. And that's the purpose of this muscular endurance training, is to engage those frontier fibers for many repetitions, so that not only does your brain become better at engaging them, but those fibers that are at this frontier of your endurance become more aerobically adapted. Now, how often do we do this kind of muscular endurance training? Almost never more than once a week. And when do we do it? Well, with our runners, we'll often start muscular endurance, assuming that they have a decent aerobic base, a relatively good pace at aerobic threshold. We can start muscular endurance work in the base period, in the fundamental period of their training. And we use that to improve the muscular endurance, so that later in their progression of fitness training, we will shift gears to a more traditional higher intensity interval training. Now, in one of the previous book groups, we talked about this, how if you have poor local muscular endurance, or you don't have good fatigue resistance in these frontier fibers, then you're going to be limited in how well you can perform traditional interval training. You're going to, let's say someone sent you to the track to do 800-meter repeats was part of your program. And these were meant to be run at a fast pace for you. Well, if after the second or third one, your legs become fatigued and you're supposed to do 6 of these or 8 or whatever it is, and you do 2 or 3, and then you can no longer maintain that pace because your legs are tired, then you're not going to get the benefit of that workout. And you're being limited in the benefits by local muscular fatigue. So that's why with our runners, we typically start in the base period to improve and establish good muscular endurance. Then later in the training, we will layer in a more traditional high intensity interval protocols. With the mountaineers, it's kind of backwards from that. In the mountaineers, we work more on developing some general maximum strength, like stepping up onto a box with a heavy weight, because that's really what their event looks like, is climbing a steep hill with a very heavy load on their back. And we do that in the early base period, and then we shift to muscular endurance. So in their case, it would be getting on that stair machine with a 60-pound pack, 25 kilos, and hiking when their legs have this sort of low-level burn in them. And that would be the way we periodize, let's say, the difference between periodization for, say, a mountain runner or skimo athlete and a mountaineer. So those are kind of our different approaches. But that sort of covers that covers this sort of general and specific look at strength training, both from a assessment standpoint and kind of how we program it. There's a good deal more information in the books on that. In our next meeting, we're going to start talking about programming. And what I have asked folks to do is come to the meeting with some specific programming questions. And we may even have an opportunity to dive into some folks' individual programming, let's say with regards to preparing for a climb or preparing for some type of an event. So that's my hope. In these next few sessions, we will really get into the weeds and talk details of how to arrange your programming. So until that next meeting, hope this helped a bit. And if you have questions, please place them on the forum in the book club section, and I will hopefully see them and get to them as soon as I can. But really appreciate all your help and your listening, and that you've paid attention. It's been a fun journey so far, and I look forward to continuing it.